Hello, it's week 5 of season 5 of the Andy Griffith Show. This week's episode title is Aunt B's Romance. Barney, what's going on this week?
A letter comes to Aunt D from somebody in Raleigh, and it turns out to be from a guy named Roger Hanover. He's an unmarried man that Aunt D used to keep company with. And so Andy says, well, invite him over. And she does just that. She writes him back and she says, come on over for supper Friday night. And then he calls and says he'll be there. And he might even be able to stay for a few days.
So he arrives and Aunt B has gone all out. She's got red lining in her jacket. She's got a new hairdo. She's got fresh ice cream in the house. And then he tells Aunt B that she's just as pretty as ever.
And then he meets Andy and Ultie, and he starts cracking all these corny jokes that aren't funny. And then the next morning, he's wearing a stupid mask at the breakfast table, and then he hits Ultie in the nose with some silly handshake joke. And then he tells Andy he left behind his footsteps. And later, Ultie asks his daddy whether he thinks Mr. Hanover might be their new uncle, and Andy says he doesn't know.
But we can see from Andy's facial expression that he's hoping no, because the guy is more annoying than he is funny.
And then later in town, Andy and Floyd see Roger and Aunt B coming out of the grocery store. And Andy introduces Roger and Floyd to each other, and Roger tries to be funny with Floyd with a couple of stale jokes. And Floyd laughs, and later he says that Roger and Aunt D would be a good match. But Andy disagrees. He says he can't stand the guy. Says he gets on his nerves.
And then after supper, Andy is in the living room trying to fix a frayed lamp cord, and Roger barges in and takes over and just ends up breaking the whole thing instead. And then he blames it on Andy when Aunt B comes in the room.
And then Aunt B and Roger both leave, and Ultie tells his daddy that he can tell that his dad don't like Roger. And Ultie says he don't like him either. And the next morning, Roger tries to take over again when Andy is trotting petunias, but this time Andy won't let him. And Andy asks Roger where he's going to be going from here, and Roger implies that he'd like to marry Aunt D and stay. But if Andy don't approve, he'll be on his way to Florida. But he wants a loan of $400 to get on his way.
And Andy won't cave into that. He says, tells Roger just to go see Aunt B in the kitchen. Turns out Roger was just bluffing because he didn't ask Aunt B to marry him after all, and he leaves anyway without the money.
And Aunt B tells Andy later, and she's glad he didn't ask her to marry him, that she was getting tired of all those jokes too. Well, I wasn't in this episode, but I'll be back next week in episode 6, called Barney's Bloodhound.
Well, good. We'll look forward to that. See you then.